Hello, my name is Susan Womack, and I work here at Millsaps College. And it's my pleasure, on behalf of the college and our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center, to welcome you to our 2021 National Day of Racial Healing. Today is an opportunity for people and organizations to come together in our common humanity and take collective action to create a more just and equitable world. A world that's free of racism and bias and inequity and injustice throughout our society. We're coming today together from different locations around the city, but I am on the Millsaps campus here in Jackson, and I just want to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Choctaw people on whose ancestral homes the college is located. So in August 2017, Millsaps was one of the first 10 institutions from around the country to be selected by the Association of American Colleges and Universities to become a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center. As part of that collective, we engage students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends in examining the underlying issues that drive racial tension in America today. And we're going to have a great conversation about that. We do this by participating in honest dialogue with each other and sharing truthful narratives about our own experiences. We come together to build relationships that foster greater understanding and empathy for each other. And our goal ultimately is about dismantling the hierarchy of human value, that belief system that says certain groups of people are more valuable than others based simply on the color of their skin, with race as the primary factor, but also we talk about gender, sexuality, and religion as well. So Millsaps is very proud to be part of this effort, which was established by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And we invite all of you and anyone who's listening today to join us in our work. You can stay informed by following us on Facebook and Instagram and through campus announcements. And also check out the My Story Monday features in the Purple and White, which is our online student publication. So without any further ado, I'm going to get this program started. And I would like to turn to our panelists, and I'm going to ask each one of you to just give a brief introduction of yourself. And then our moderator, Demi Brown, will take it from there. Demi, I'll start with you. If you could just give us a brief introduction, that would be great.
Thank you, Susan. My name is Demi Brown. I am the Dean of Students and Chief Diversity Officer here at Millsaps College. I am in my 5th year here at the college, and I'm happy to participate in this important conversation and dialogue today. I've been a part of Millsaps's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center's efforts from our founding. And I think this type of work is very important for our community, city and state, to engage in. We've got to start telling the truth. And we've seen over the last week or so, if we have not, the importance of truth telling.
Rob, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Rob Lowry. I'm a Millsaps alum and pastor at Fondren Presbyterian Church in Jackson. And have been very excited to get reconnected with the college and to be a part of this work. I feel like I graduated about 27 years too early. This seems like a great time to be on campus right now.
Thank you. Luanda?
I'm Luanda Evans. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Millsaps. I have been here 8 years. I also do some work, or have done some work, with the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty, and I do lots of work with some of our great organizations in the city of Jackson.
Thank you. Natalie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Collier. I am the founder and president of the Lighthouse Black Girl Projects, whose headquarters are here in Jackson, Mississippi. I also am a Millsaps alumna. I graduated in 2002, and a part of the work that we do at the Lighthouse is coming back home for me to Millsaps and working toward healing relationships between the institution and some of the young people on campus, uniquely, as you might guests, young Black women.
Thank you. And Michael?
So I'm Michael Pickard. I teach English and creative writing here at Millsaps, and I'm also the E.B. Stewart Family Professor of Language and Literature at the college. Like Natalie, I'm coming back to Millsaps after being a student, like Rob as well. I graduated 2004, and I feel excited about being here at Millsaps in this moment and being part of conversations to push our community towards the ideals that we hold for it. And I'm just glad to be here working alongside Natalie and Rob and Luanda and Susan and Demi.
Thank you. So Demi, I'll turn it back over to you to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Susan, so much for that. And I'm thankful for our panelists for agreeing to participate in this important conversation. The summer of 2020 saw a number of protests throughout mostly urban areas in the country, centered around racial justice, centered around police brutality, centered around community policing. So we saw what our national reaction was to those protests. There was initially, if you look at the polling, initial support that waned over time for those protesters from different segments of our population. And then in January, we had this protest that turned into an insurrection at our nation's capital. And one of the things that was striking for me was the visible difference between the response from police efforts in those two seminal moments. And I just wanted to get from you all, first, your initial thoughts on that striking difference, and your second thoughts of potentially, can you share why? What makes you think that what we saw was real? So that, because we hear all the time, that's not real, you're making that up. So I want to know why did we see that? What constructs are there that allow that to happen? So we'll begin this part of the conversation. And I know, Luanda, you do a lot of work related to the criminal justice system. Students here talk the number of students that talk very fondly about your courses around these topics is really impressive. So I want to get your thoughts first.
Well, truthfully, Demi, it's hard to even figure out where to start because it's such a complex issue. I have to acknowledge why we saw protests this past summer and why we've seen protests over the years for the mistreatment of people of color. And I think it goes beyond police brutality. I'm really moving away from using that word because it involves death oftentimes. And so it is a form to me of what I'd call systemic police terror. And the reason that I use that word, that really strong word, is because we can also see how the threat of the police is used to terrorize particular communities and people. And so I want to start there, but I want to sort of also move into what happened in January. And since we're having a real life, honest conversation, I was not surprised at all in terms of how the police handle the situation, because it's typically how they handle those situations when we see these sort of terroristic acts engaged by folks who are not of color, if that makes sense. And so I can remember my mom and or sister both texting me oh my God, can you believe what's happening? And yes, I can believe what's happening. And yes, I can believe that it's being handled that way. I think part of the narrative, and I still see this, and we can see it even in wording, how folks protesting systemic injustice are often called thugs, yet it took a while to move to that sort of place with what happened at the Capitol. They were called a mob. Even just the differences in language, and the language can invoke thought and everything else. It's more than symbolic. And so I could believe that it was happening. I did believe it was real. It told me a lot. It saddened me in lots of ways. And, once the conversation comes back around to me, I can talk about some of that. But it also made me very angry and very tired. So I'll stop there and let some of the other panelists talk about it, and then I can hop back in if I have something else to add. But it's emotionally taxing to have it sort of in your face and be very, very real. And yet folks still say it's not, that it wasn't based on race. in terms of police treatment of and police engagement, as a matter of fact, in those events.
And one of the things that I'd like to get to also in conversation, and you point to it when you talk about systemic terror, is the fact that we're learning about the number of police that were actually involved in the groups, in the thug mob group. And so we're learning about that sort of connection between these groups and police agencies. And so I think that's an interesting part that I'd like to maybe spend some time talking through later. Rob?
You just touched on what I wanted to bring up, actually, which is the startling number of police who were involved last week and the response of different policing organizations to that participation. We've seen so much reaction from the business community and the political community, the press. Everyone has sort of gotten on this short-term bandwagon of outrage. But I was listening yesterday to a podcast about Arkansas politics, my home state, and there were active duty officers from several departments in the state, including the state police. And every agency is declining to even investigate, to even think about it, to even talk about it, to even look and see, was this officer standing on the Capitol lawn stunned by what was happening, or were they marauding through the halls of the Congress? There's just an unwillingness to even engage in the conversation. And I think, when we talk about not being surprised last week, I wasn't surprised. Luanda, she said, I wasn't surprised by what happened last Wednesday. A colleague and I were talking about it the other day, and she made the, I think, very astute point that there was probably inevitable what happened last Wednesday. Because that was an event that didn't start in the ellipse in front of the White House. The momentum that built and pushed people through those barricades and past those officers has been building for generations in this country. And what we saw, I think, in the Capitol was the collision of the systemic assumption that white anger is benign, and the reality that that kind of violence and rhetoric has become acceptable from a certain portion of the population, for lack of a better way of saying it. I don't think it is acceptable, but I think that we have culturally come to accept some words from some voices and some behaviors from some people, which is the sum total of an entire systemic movement toward that moment.
And I'm going to follow through the way it's arranged on my screen. Michael?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I want to add to this conversation comes to something that you said towards the end of your opening remarks, Demi, and that is about the immediate attempt at deniability that also accompanied this whole event. One of the things that was not surprising, but also stunning to hear at the same time was the immediate effort to voice some of the blame for what we witnessed on sort of planted Antifa and other groups, as though somehow what the cameras captured all too stunningly and brutally for all of us to see, didn't really happen in the way. There was an immediate effort to challenge what the cameras made clear to us that really happened there. And I think that the deniability piece is such a big part of the conversation that we're having. Ibram Kendi has an article that he published in the Atlantic this past week in which he says, and it's his line, his title, "Denial is the heartbeat of America when it comes to racial violence and when it comes to violence against other minority groups." And so just as soon as we see acts of violence, we see attempts to deny either the significance or the extent. We see, the secondary effort to somehow pretend that what happened wasn't so bad, or that it's not as much of a threat to who we really think we are as a country as it is. And I think that Kendi is really good on how this tendency has informed so many moments of American history. And in that sense, I think that we are, replaying a story that our country has played over and over and over and over again in really depressing ways. And so that's the piece, maybe as an English professor who teaches classes in interpretation, that I'm most interested in talking about, is the extent to which media have enabled participants to attempt to deflect blame, or to misdirect or to redirect the truth in ways that attempt to diminish the impact of what really has happened, and to falsify our narrative.
Michael, thank you for that. And it reminds me of something that I read online Wednesday evening. And it was from a commentator, and she commented, "I've heard so often in the last 6 months, this is not who we are. I am left wondering, do we know who we are?" Mm-hmm. Which sort of put me in a way of thinking about and contextualizing some of the things that you outlined in what you're saying. Natalie, what are your thoughts?
Oh God. I have a lot of thoughts. I'm already physically uncomfortable. One of the things that Rob said that really stood out to me was talking about when he talked about this idea that that we have come to accept, generally speaking, that white anger is benign, and he went on to talk about, Rob went on to talk about a certain section of the population. I think there are very few non-white people in this country who believe that white anger is benign. I can, of course, only speak most fluently about the Black experience, but I'm even thinking about a conversation there. We have a Colombian young woman on staff, and we had a conversation yesterday. Every Wednesday, we have a conversation about like what's happening in the world. And the conversation kind of veered over to, what happened last week. And one of the things that she said was about being here was that, on one hand, one of the things that she learned very quickly was not to speak Spanish in public. Mm-hmm. But then she went on to talk about how not only is she careful to not speak Spanish in public, she is careful not to speak in public at all because she has an accent. And so what that brings out of the people that she is around, and just being mindful of her environment, right? And she is not a dark-skinned Colombian woman, but she is also not white passing. And so how she has to kind of tiptoe, like I'm trying to figure this thing out. And so this idea that particularly at this point in the nation's history, that there is a person of color generally in this country, uniquely a Black person in this country, who confronts or interfaces with a white person with whom they don't have a relationship with, who does not see that white body as violence. I think that's that is not, if they say otherwise, they're not being honest with themselves. What the insurrection at the Capitol taught us was, what it affirmed for us was all the things that we knew to be true anecdotally. Even down to not only were there, the people who never quite, there was always something not quite right about them in high school who ended up being cops a couple years later, right? But then, so not only are they cops, right, but then you have here what has happened at the Capitol. So not only have they showed up, but then there are also the people who are not, it's not just you broke the windows at the Capitol. There are cops who are a part of the Capitol, police, who are letting them in. Like, it's not just people that broke in. We see videos of people letting them in. So, yeah, I have a whole lot to say. I'll pause right there though.
All right, Luanda?
I'm just affirming what Natalie said. Like, there is so much that's actually going through the brain. My ears are literally on fire right now just because there's so much. This is stuff that we've known as lived experience, and we've also seen via either we've experienced it or through media presentations or whatever else. And it just really ticks me off that it's come to this, that people are now saying, well, maybe they treated people a little bit differently because they weren't of color. When we have folks that died trying to sleep, we didn't have this much anger over what we saw in these detention centers that were happening to Latinx folks. It's a bit of a sort of emotionally and physically draining experience to even have to grapple with what we see, what we saw, and then have some outlets look at this as though it's an extreme case without wanting to talk about the normality of this sort of aggression and violence. And there is something normative about it. You can ask, underrepresented groups, and they would say there's a bit of that's not an extreme case for the most part. Maybe breaking into the Capitol, yes, but white violence, no.
And Luanda, Rob, I'll bring you in
real quick.
Okay, go ahead, Rob.
Natalie, a light bulb went off in my head as you were speaking, because you acknowledged something that I said, not realizing I had said it. I did what so many white Americans do, which was conflate white perspective with the American experience. And that is so ingrained. I mean, I try to be someone who's conscious of those things, and even here in conversation where we try to be intentional with our words. It is so ingrained culturally in us to equate that. And the reason I mentioned that is I don't want to let it go unsaid, the complicity of the church in what happened last Wednesday. Mm-hmm. Because we saw a lot of imagery and we heard a lot of rhetoric that comes from the white Protestant tradition. Mm-hmm. At the Capitol last week. And that comes from what I consider to be the Faustian bargain that the church made centuries ago when it wedded itself to the power of the state. And in America, in the American experience, that power is not just political, it's also economic, it's also racial. And the complicity of the church, I think, I say this from inside the church, both as a church leader and literally sitting inside the church right now. We have to say that. I think as a church, we have to own the misuse of the church's theology, its vocabulary, its imagery, and its history in moments like what happened last Wednesday, but also the justification that's been given to the rhetoric that is resistant to the Black Lives Matter movement and the awareness that BLM has raised in the country. the fact that many church leaders have pushed back against that awareness as if it is somehow theologically problematic. I think that's one of the things the church has to bear witness to, because it is our sin as a church, and we have to name it and own it, and we are the ones who need to repent and reconcile.
Rob, thank you for sharing that. I think I had written a note about coming back to, at some point in this conversation, the role of the church in helping us move forward, and also acknowledging where we are contemporarily today. But when Luanda was talking earlier, she laid out a term that I've been sitting with for a moment. I'm going to have to spend some time thinking on it. I think back to a conversation I had with you, Luanda, about 3 years ago, when we were standing in the parking lot outside in Olin, and you said one of your frustrations with this contemporary conversation is that people keep talking about systemic oppression, but they have yet to be able to articulate a system. And so that sat with me as I thought about, every time I'm listening to someone have conversations about these issues, when people have adopted a language around it, but do they really understand what that language brings forward? And so when you brought up systemic police terror, that's where my mind went. And I'd like for you, does that resonate with you as we have this conversation? Do you see how I'm connecting that to what you put down that day in the parking lot when we were talking?
Yeah, I say a lot of stuff. And so
He's trying to call you out, sis. He's trying to call you out.
Yeah, I mean, one of the goals as a professor is to really give people, students, young folks, all of us, myself included, a language to be able to appropriately articulate stuff. Making sure we really understand what things mean, and then how those things also have particular types of consequences. So, writing about systemic police terror really took me in a direction that we need to also start to connecting these things to particular types of outcomes. And it's bigger than just individuals. This is sort of community-wide. Like, I didn't have to know George Floyd to be devastated by what happened. There are health outcomes, there are consequences that we think about that are just bigger than us. And so, I do think about systems when folks just don't even know how to define a system. Again, it's bigger than just the police. You can even threaten me. I'm going to call the police on you, and I'm going to have a very visible reaction, because that's dangerous, right? So, Demi, I hope that I'm, sort of answering what you mentioned, but if not, we can come back to it. But yeah, just think about systems and how systems, kind of work together to give us particular types of outcomes.
You did, and I was really hopeful that we would get to a conversation about outcomes, because that's what I was did a poor job articulating, trying to get to, but the outcomes in that matter. One of the things that we've seen in the conversations in the media is a very visible difference in the language about how these groups have been described, from the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer versus the Capitol insurrection. It has been striking to me at how hesitant our media was to label what happened what it was. I should not be surprised, because we have these conversations all the time, and in my mind, I hope that somebody has learned something and will do some things differently. But Susan, I want to bring you into this part of the conversation, because I called you on Wednesday because I was struggling, and we sat and we talked about, first off, we supported each other and cared for each other. So I thank you for your friendship in that moment. But we spent some time talking about some of the language issues. And so what comes up for you when I present that idea and that thought and that question about the language we use?
Well, I think about it a lot. And I recognize it a lot just in everyday language. I recognize it in conversations. I recognize the difference in talking about that event, but it also just in talking about people and other events. Before my Millsaps experience, I worked for Parents for Public Schools. And, one of the things we try to do in our TRHT work is relate or have people think about their own experiences in the context of these much larger experiences. And one of the things that I've sort of been reflecting on that is not as big, I suppose, as what we've seen on television, but certainly as a matter of daily life, my experience working in a majority Black school district, where my son was a student, very much part of the minority, and the difference even in the way we were treated and the language that was used in our experience in public schools. I mean, I think about even the policing going to a football game where everybody who walks in the gate, has to be wanded down with the security thing until we get there, and then we're just waved right on through. So those simple experiences, daily experiences in the lives of a lot of white people, we don't think about enough, and we need to think about them more. We need to think about how our lives are different, how we walk through life differently in sometimes very simple ways and sometimes very complex ways. But certainly the language part of it and the fact that initially, the talk was people going into the Capitol, and it really took a while for them to begin to talk about this as well, first it was a riot, but it took a while to get to the violent part of it. And I think the only way media and a lot of people the only way they got to that point was because they were forced to get to that point. The video wouldn't allow, force them to sort of begin to call it what it was. And I just think that's something that we have to think about a lot, and something that we have to work on in our own lives, in our daily interactions with people, but also in much bigger ways. I mean, the language we use is really, really important. Does that answer? I mean, does that
absolutely
make sense?
It does. Thank you for sharing that. Michael, I know this is that conversation about the media narrative is really important to you. So I'm going to ask you to join into that conversation.
Sure, and I just want to go back for a second to the earlier point about even putting the events that we saw happen this summer into comparison with or a conversation, with the events of the last week. The context behind those events are so different, and I think for me, one of the visible manifestations of the difference in context is that room in the museum downtown, the Civil Rights Museum downtown, where the names of lynched persons line columns for as long as you can see in one room. That there is a history of violence against Black people, and of state-sponsored violence against Black people that informs the events that we saw happen this summer in a way that is different for the white insurrectionists at the Capitol. But I do want to say also about the language conversation. I mean, look, I'm no media expert, but I think that money and demographics make what we have seen in terms of labeling and naming sadly, unsurprising. I think that media, the media that we depend on are largely owned and run by white people, and that network audiences are framing their coverage for white Americans, and I think that plays a role in how we employ language. I mean, everything that Susan said about being careful and thinking about the language that we use and being aware of white presence and how our sort of experience of white people influence the way that we move through the world. I completely agree with, but I think that it is not terribly surprising to me that it took the media a long time to call this what it was, because of who owns the media and how much money and the kind of the power dynamic at play behind media representation is governed by the white majority, and so I think that that's at least part of this conversation that I'd be interested to talk about.
I'd like to add something to that, if I can. I think that just as important in this conversation about media as whiteness is, capital W whiteness is power, as Michael pointed out, because those in this context in particular are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And it takes a particular courageousness, though it should not, a particular courageousness and a particular courageousness, whichever, sorry, and a particular allegiance to your the people to whom you are working to communicate, and about that which you are looking to communicate. I think about Chokwe Lumumba, not Chokwe Antar, but Chokwe Lumumba, who would say, if you are not loyal to the people, if you do not love the people, sooner or later you will betray the people, right? And so I think that it's the same thing with media. So it's not just about the language we use or don't use. It's the reason that we choose to use it and not use it based on who has the power, who we perceive has the power, and our acquisition to power. And I'll give you an example for that. One of the projects that we have, we do a lot of first person narrative writing and that kind of thing on the platform, but we also do news writing. But we are very particular about who it is we're trying to communicate to, even though we're just covering news stories, right? And we are covering news stories. We are never, one of the things we were very clear about from the beginning is that we are not looking to break news. There are people who break news. What we are looking to do is tell the stories behind the headlines. What's happening in the news do you need to know? So when we post links from the website on Facebook, depending on who comes across it, we can get some pretty hateful stuff. Just today, one of the young women who works as an editor sent me a screenshot of some pretty vile stuff that people said under, some news stories that we have posted. She was pretty shaken up. Well, I've done media for a while, so I just laughed. But then I had to think about it because this is newer to her than it is to me, right? So I'm like, are you okay? Right? Because to me, it's just like, oh, these white people are crazy. No offense, y'all. But, it's just like these white people are crazy. Wait, I'm sorry. Alexis, are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. What do I do with this? You just hide the messages. Like, this doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing. Like, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. There aren't enough people who tell stories, report news, who are committed to communicating what needs to be communicated. So oftentimes, I am of the opinion, I just started talking loud, y'all. I'm sorry, let me calm down. Oftentimes, I am of the opinion that it is not always necessarily about the words we use, because we get really wrapped up in vocabulary, right? Like, is this person using this polysyllabic word or not? Because we sometimes use that as virtue signaling. Like, oh yeah, they're talking my language. Sometimes it's not about the words that we're using. It's how we're saying what we're saying and who we're talking to. And that is writ large the problem with mainstream media, in my humble opinion.
Thank you for pointing that out. I think as we have learned recently in our media history, the importance of those first person narratives, people putting it on their cell phone live for you to see, unfiltered, unedited, and the importance of that you can actually, we physically, literally saw what was happening at the Capitol, and no one got to edit it for us. They were broadcasting it live right there over Twitter accounts, without pundits, without editing, and so people got to take it in raw and viscerally. Rob?
I'm still soaking in a couple of things that have been said. I think that that really what Natalie just said about the media is spot on. That so much of what is said, so much of what is not said as well, is rooted in power and power structures. But I think that we very easily give it a pass when the vocabulary comes around to what we might prefer it to be. I mean, I think about all the self-congratulations the last week as different commentators and reporters and TV personalities have jumped on the bandwagon of Trump is dangerous, which they danced around for 4 years. And I don't mean to bring partisanship into it, but just the rhetoric was talked about, but it wasn't dealt with in reporting in a lot of ways. And it's the self-congratulation that goes along with this. Well, now that we're at the end of the road, we're all going to jump on the bandwagon when it's safe to do so. Seems to be the way that plays itself out more often than not. This summer, as the voices for justice across the country were growing louder and louder and louder, it took a while for the media to begin talking about what was happening as something other than a policing issue. It took a while before the vocabulary of justice, of equality, of human dignity, of human rights became part of the conversation, because talking about policing is safe. Talking about these other things is a threat to the structures that perpetuate it.
And Rob, I'm going to hold the conversation with you for just a second and transition into our next part of the conversation. I had the pleasure of reading your editorial on the recent passing of Governor William Winter. It was a fantastic piece, so thank you for writing it. But one of the big messages in that piece is we'll take it from here. I want to get the panelists' thought on that concept of we'll take it from here. Where are we and where are we going? It's more of that came up for me while I literally wrote it down while I was reading your editorial. And so when you say we'll take it from here, what's the intention behind that? What are you pushing people to think and believe and want to achieve?
I think a couple of things. The first is that I have struggled over the last year, like a lot of people have struggled over the last year, with not letting myself become defined by cynicism, when it just seemed like it was one thing after another, after another, after another all year long, whether health, society, politics, whatever it might be. I think the first thing I'm calling on all of us to do is to have faith in the future, that there really is a better way of doing the world, for lack of a better way of saying it, than what we're doing now. And that there really is the capacity in our communities to do that. So I think the first thing I was thinking about is having that kind of confidence and possibility that there's worthwhile work to be done for worthwhile outcomes. But the other piece of that is, I think that there's also, I think we need a mutual call to action in the world. And I think that call to action, we often think, is a matter of all of us joining together and doing the same thing. If I've learned anything the last five or 6 years of my life, it's that my job in moving some of these conversations forward is different than what some of my neighbors is. And I'll give you an example. I work in a couple of groups with clergy in the city, and we do a lot of work together. And I was in a meeting with 5 other clergy and 2 civic leaders. Both civic leaders were white. My 5 clergy colleagues are all African-American. Every time those guys, the 2 civic folks, asked a question of the group, they looked at me first. Not because they just assumed I was the spokesperson for the group. I'm the most junior, most inexperienced, newest to Jackson in the room. But the center of gravity kept shifting toward me. So I learned that my job is often not to talk. That part of what my job is to hear a story other than my own, to hear wisdom that does not come from my lived experience, but comes from a lived experience that I don't share. So I think that sometimes that the doing of things, that we'll take it from here of it in terms of what we do and how we do it, needs more contextualization than we've often given it. Because it's not simply a matter of picking up society and moving it forward, because there's a lot of it we need to leave behind. And I need, from where I sit, I mean, I'm a cisgendered man. I'm a gay man, but I'm a cisgendered white man in America. So there's a lot of lived experience that hasn't taught me. And so part of what I need to do is listen to stories and listen to the wisdom of my friends and my neighbors who can help me understand what it is what baggage I need to leave behind.
Luanda, taking that concept forward and moving forward, and Rob brought up something that we need to leave some things behind in order to move forward. When we think about these concepts of moving forward as a society, as a culture, what are your thoughts on that? Are we achieving what we want to achieve? I'm just curious as to what you think about that, because first off, I trust you as a friend and a thinker.
And you may have to come back to me on this, just because there's sort of a lot going through the skull right now. Because I'm even wondering, like, I'm picking apart words now, like, who are we? Like, who's we? What is forward? What do we want to achieve? Like, those particular things I think are different for different groups. And then I think about the complexity of it all, the complexities of it all. Like, it's not just, I'm not very optimistic, because if we take what everybody's saying here and start to put it together, Susan's talked about the public education system here in Jackson. I mean, we have to think about there are deeper sort of racial implications there as well. And so we can say we're going to have these conversations and progress. We have to think about that aspect of how are we going to progress to make sure that there's educational equality for our kids. And then if we think about the church, I mean, it's still one of the most segregated places that you can visit. And how is that, how would that work? And then if we think about policing and criminal justice and the racial injustices there, I don't know how to fix that. And truthfully, I am tired of it being a call that we need to do something, because it's not all of us that need to do more or do something, right? So, Demi, I'm not, I'm not sure, even when Michael and Natalie and Rob and Susan were talking about the media, we have to think about the fact that it's just incredibly difficult for some folks to even create a negative narrative about a group that they're members of, if that makes sense. It's just really tough, right? Because we don't want to see, or we don't want our group to be seen in a negative way. So I'm not very, optimistic that we will see any large scale change or difference in my lifetime, but I can hope that it's in the lifetime of my kids. And I'll talk about that, why this is so interwoven in the very fabric of our nation. And so, Demi, I don't know. I
have those same thoughts. I by nature, I feel like I'm an optimist. I try to look forward to things. I try to think that we're on the right path, but I find myself more and more questioning that. And and questioning it is, am I paying attention to what I'm seeing, or am I paying attention to my internal drive for hope and change? And in some ways, I really want to pay more attention to what's really in front of me and what am I seeing? The concept of we, when there is a group of people saying we need to change and we need to move forward, and there are another group of people who, for moving forward to them, is actually going back to the good old days. That is their forward. And so all of that is layered in there for me. And so you're right about even contextualizing we. Susan, we spent a lot of time talking about narratives in that conversation about who are we and how do we even know who we are. And I know that the narrative part is really key to you. Can you share any of your thoughts on that as it relates to this conversation we're having?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I like to consider myself to be an optimistic person, and I'm not somebody who can just give up hope. But I've been disappointed a lot. And I think that, one of the things that I can be hopeful about, especially when we talk about narrative, is that the problems are so big and so complex. But when we start with individual people and when we start with our own narratives, when we do what we can about us, when we listen intently to other people and their stories without judgment, and when we begin to see ourselves in other people, or at least parts of ourselves in other people, I think we can hopefully begin to move forward. And forward for me is relationships. Forward for me is in my corner of the world, creating something that is fairer, that is more equitable, whether it's on the Millsaps campus or whether it's in the Jackson community or wherever it is. Really working on something. I have to be working on something because I have to be doing something. I don't think we as individuals or collectively can just throw our hands in, and I don't think any of us would do that anyway. But as far as narrative goes, I think narrative has to start with us. It has to start with our own truthful narratives. We have to somehow find ways to know who we are, to understand our own experiences, to in many ways come to terms with our own experiences. I know that's what being a white adult who grew up in the Jim Crow era of Mississippi has been for me. It's been a reckoning with my historical past and how I was raised, and the air that I breathed growing up was full of Jim Crow. And so I couldn't help but be an adult that was somewhat full of Jim Crow. And so that's my work. My work is coming to terms with my own narrative, leaving that part of me behind, building a new me that can move myself forward and hopefully help others move forward.
Natalie, I want to pull you into this a little bit also, well, a lot bit. Your thoughts on this concept of moving forward or not, and what are your thoughts? Is there hope there for you?
I have hope in as much as I get up every day and keep going. My work and my life are, like people talk about their life and their work life. Those for me are inextricably linked. And so I have hope in that I keep doing it. I don't know how to not do what I believe I've been called to do. I have very little optimism. I'm not an optimist. I have never been. Like I wasn't as a child. So I don't have a lot of confidence that this hope and change that people want to see, we'll just say the good people, that good people want to see will happen. I think good people should keep working toward it. But no, I'm not very optimistic that it will come to bear. Because it takes a lot of hard work, and there has to be a reckoning. Susan talked about beginning to see ourselves as other people. And one of the things that I think people don't give enough credence to is that people who were at the Capitol last week and people of their ilk, maybe people who couldn't go because of other obligations, or maybe they just couldn't go because they were too embarrassed, right? Those people, those kinds of people some divine intervention notwithstanding, will never see me as human. And so there isn't a lot of coming together and reasoning that I can do with a person like that. So that's one thing. And then one other thing is that I know that people don't like to be comfortable. And again, as we saw last week, particularly white people don't like to be uncomfortable, generally speaking, right? And any kind of real racial healing and reconciliation and real work toward anti-racism and anti-xenophobia and work that eradicates anti-Blackness requires an uprooting and excavation. And my friend Phyllis, one of my dearest friends, she just got a pathology report back this week. She is now cancer-free. But before we knew that, she had to go to chemo. And chemo was hell. Chemo was hell. And now, and then after chemo, she had to have a lump removed from her breast. She's cancer-free now. She still has to go to radiation. And then she still has to take maintenance drugs and then has to be checked on regularly for 5 years. Right? To heal, you got to do a whole lot of work and you got to go through a whole lot of pain. And I don't think people want to do that. That's for her to be whole. She had to go through that to be whole. This country don't want to do that. I think it can be done individually. I count Michael a friend, right? I can't count the majority of people friendly, white people friendly toward me, and any children in my life, friends in this country. because history tells me that it is not judicious for me to do that.
Michael?
Gosh, I just am so moved by what Natalie was just saying, and I agree with everything. And I think that your kind of implied description of what we are dealing with as a cancer that needs a form of chemotherapy, I just thought was so well suggested. And so I, just beyond what Natalie and Luanda and Rob and we've all said, I think what makes me less hopeful, I just throughout our conversation today have been thinking about James Baldwin and a couple of things James Baldwin says in an essay called Stranger in the Village. And one of the things he says there is there's a great deal of willpower in the white man's naivete. There's a great deal of willpower. I guess the naivete of so many white people depresses me, and the willpower that stands behind that. And I think what Natalie said far better than what I was going to say, but I agree with her. And one of the things that I think needs to happen so that we can even have a chance of beginning to make progress is some truth telling and some acknowledgement. And it goes back to what Luanda was saying a second ago about just how unwilling so many of us are to acknowledge negative narratives about ourselves or to be honest about our complicity or our contributions to an unjust, unequal, violent system. It's not easy to be honest and to say, one of the things I tell my students is that, and this is slightly off topic, but I think it's related, is that I vote, I pay taxes, I am considered legally an American citizen. I have no idea what my government, my country, what the military associated with it does around the world on a given day. There are so many acts that I am potentially complicit in that I will never know about because of the way that our system is organized. And I think that fundamental sense of complicity and just being willing to be truthful with ourselves. It is, Natalie's right. I don't know how much willpower there is to do that kind of truth telling, but I think that, those of us on this call are committed to trying to do some of that. And I think that, in my own exhaustion and my own frustration with what I see, I think community and being with other people who share values that I have, I think provides some measure of hope. The last thing I'll say, I'm kind of going out of order in my thought sequence here, but there was an interesting comment on the 538 website earlier today about how resistant people are to having their minds changed from outside opinion and how much change has to come from within. And that worries me and frustrates me too, because I think that, barring divine intervention, as Natalie said, it is going to be really, really, really difficult to persuade people who are unwilling to recognize their white supremacy that the problem exists. And so I guess if I had to sum up, I'd just say community gives me some hope being together with like-minded people. But I just agree with Natalie. And Luanda, it's a sad and frustrating time to live in.
This conversation today has been, for me, one of the most informative opportunities I've had to listen recently. I think I've learned so much in just this short time that we've been together. Natalie's comments about uncomfortability resonated with me in a way that that I see the truth in that, the honest to God truth in that. I want to thank our panelists for being here with us today, but also leave room if there's anything else that they feel like they want to add to the conversation that they didn't get a chance to say before we close the program.
I'd like to say one thing, Demi, if I may, just to it dawned on me as Luanda was speaking, and then again, when Natalie and Michael were speaking, that I think that one of the things we don't talk about often is the likelihood of us culturally moving together from one place to the other is so minimal because our experiences are so different. I think part of what has to happen if we're going to see racial reconciliation and if we're going to see real anti-racism in America, part of what has to happen is that white America has to begin to understand the untruth that white America needs to be liberated from. That was a lot of what we saw last Wednesday was the declaration of untruth in the Capitol. There was the illusion of what is right and what is supposed to be. James Cone, who's one of my favorite teachers I ever had, and is just a thinker whose writing has shaped my ministry incredibly. In The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he says, truth is divine action entering our lives and creating human action of liberation. And I think we often look heavenward for that truth, that divine truth. But I think it comes in these conversations. I think it comes in every time we take the time and energy to learn and grow together with one another and from one another. That's divine truth at work. And that divine truth, from my perspective, where I sit in the world, is liberating. Liberating from untruth that defines so much of who we are.
Thank you. That seems a very appropriate closing for us today. So thank you, Rob. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. And I think we could have another conversation like this very soon. There's so much that was just brought to surface today in this conversation. One of the things that Susan and I talk about often when we're dealing with these issues is that even entering dialogue in these topics takes something from you in some ways. And so we have to make sure that we're protective of ourselves, that we're supporting and caring for each other in the right ways. Even engaging and thinking about these things has, as Natalie talked about at the beginning of our conversation, a physical reaction to at times. And so I do want to acknowledge to our panel that to first thank you for participating, but understanding that there is an emotional tax to bringing forward these thoughts and ideas. And though it is our work and in our lives, we still remain affected by the conditions that we live in and the things that we see. So thank you all so very much for today. I really do appreciate you and your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Demi.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.